Welcome back to another deep dive.
Cool.
We have a truly mind-bending journey ahead of us today.
We really do.
Yeah, because if you have ever been sitting at your desk, trying to hit a deadline, and you pull up one of those focus playlists on your streaming app, you might have noticed something.
It doesn't sound like normal music.
Right, the tracks start sounding less like traditional songs and more like, well, recordings from the inside of a submarine.
That is a very accurate way to describe it, actually.
And you aren't putting that music on to actively listen to a catchy melody. You are putting it on to literally change the physical atmosphere of the room you are sitting in.
Exact.
So if you are nodding your head right now, you are going to absolutely love what we are exploring today. Our mission is to take a stack of incredible research, primarily drawing from a brilliantly detailed column from Monumental Movement Records, or MMR, and act as your shortcut to understanding a radical shift in audio design.
It really is a massive shift.
We are tracking the evolution of ambient techno and a highly abstract subgenre known as deep ambient or deep sea ambient. We want to figure out how certain types of electronic music completely transformed from being a specific event that you actively pay attention to into a physical environment that you actually live inside of.
Because it is a profound shift in how humans interact with sound. We are looking at a deliberate design philosophy where the traditional rules of music, things like a clear narrative structure, an obvious beginning, a middle, and end, and commanding foot-tapping rhythms, those are entirely thrown out the window.
Just gone.
Gone. Instead, the goal is to create a sense of sinking time, a feeling of spatial pressure, and a state of continuous existence.
Okay, let's unpack this. To really get why this is so revolutionary, we need to lay down some groundwork. Let's look at ambient techno, which the research shows really crystallized in the early 1990s.
Right, early to mid-90s.
The core idea was taking the mechanical, highly repetitive rhythm structures of techno music and somehow marrying them directly to the vast, sustained floating qualities of ambient music.
Which sounds impossible on paper.
It does. So you end up with a genre that holds on to the distinct time sense of club music, but it simultaneously functions perfectly as something you can just sit back and appreciate on a purely aesthetic level without ever moving a muscle.
And then deep ambient takes that delicate balance and pushes it to the absolute extreme.
How so?
Well, while ambient techno still holds onto a rhythmic framework, like you can still find a pulse in it, deep ambient is far more abstract. It entirely removes the requirement for a beat.
No beat at all.
There is no pulse demanding your attention. Instead, it relies on an extreme sense of depth, utilizing sustained, drawn-out tones heavily focused in the low-frequency bands. By doing this, it completely blurs the edges of time. You aren't following a beat from measure to measure anymore. You are simply existing in a suspended sonic state.
Which is wild. And to understand how producers even got to the point of creating a suspended state, we have to look at the prehistory here. Because reading the sources, it reads like a collision between two very different worlds that somehow smashed together.
Two complete opposites.
Yeah, first you have the original ambient music scene that formed in the 1970s. The entire philosophy back then was that music should function as a piece of furniture.
Right, the whole Brian Eno concept of furniture music.
Exactly, should be part of the environment itself. To achieve that, producers were actively minimizing any kind of melody, taking away any dramatic development or big emotional crescendos. The sound was designed to command the space rather than demand your focused attention.
Just letting the sound exist in the room.
Right. Then you contrast that entirely with the techno scene that roared to life in the late 1980s. Techno was built around a completely different set of goals. We were talking about loud, repetitive beats and mechanical precision, where the primary, almost singular function was to induce physical movement on a sweaty dance floor.
So on the surface, you couldn't find two genres more opposed to one another. One wants you to sit completely still and blend into the wallpaper, and the other demands that you move your body with relentless mechanical energy.
They sound totally incompatible.
They do, but beneath the surface, there was a deeply embedded shared DNA. Both genres actually relied heavily on three core elements: duration repetition and a non-narrative structure.
Oh.
Neither 1970s ambient nor 1980s techno is trying to tell you a traditional story with a beginning, climax, and resolution. They just lock you into a groove or a space for an extended period.
So they both just keep you in one place.
Exactly. And by the time we hit the late 1980s and early 1990s, the surrounding club culture had matured significantly. People were spending 8, 10, 12 hours in these massive warehouse spaces.
That's a long time to be dancing.
Too long.
Hmm.
There was a sudden, very practical demand for music that could function outside the main dance floor in the chill-out rooms, or music that could support the non-peak early morning hours of the night. Because of those shared foundational elements of repetition and duration, ambient and techno naturally gravitated toward each other to fill that new cultural need.
Which brings us to the pioneering act I kept seeing highlighted in the MMR column, the orb.
Yes, absolutely crucial.
They seem to be the absolute catalyst here. They took ambient textures, techno structures, and the heavy spatial processing of dub music and managed to integrate them all into an acoustic structure that could withstand long-term continuous playback.
They created an entirely new listening experience.
Traditional narrative arcs are incredibly scarce in their work. The sounds just float around you, they circulate, they mutate very, very slowly.
And their approach to rhythm specifically changed the game for electronic music. When you listen to a defining track by the Orb, even in the moments where rhythm is pushed to the foreground of the mix, it never flaunts its propulsion.
It's not trying to hype you up.
Right, it doesn't push you forward or build anticipation for a beat drop. The beat is no longer a mechanical device ordering you to move your body. Instead, it functions as a reference point for measuring depth.
Now, reference point.
It anchors the floating sounds. That specific design philosophy became the absolute foundation for ambient techno, and it directly paved the way for the deep ambient and deep sea expressions that followed.
Here's where it gets really interesting. I want to talk about that deep sea concept. I initially thought deep sea ambient was just a clever poetic name music journalists came up with, because the music sounds a bit watery.
A lot of people assume that.
But the research stresses that this is a literal auditory metaphor. These producers are attempting to use sound engineering to recreate the actual environment of the ocean floor. A place where light doesn't reach, where your sense of distance is completely lost, and where your directional awareness becomes totally ambiguous.
They are achieving that by mimicking the actual physics of underwater sound.
How does that work?
Well, if you look at the physical conditions of the deep ocean, high frequencies like the sharp chirp of a bird or the crash of a cymbal rapidly decay and disappear in water, they simply can't travel.
They just get swallowed up.
Exactly. However, low frequencies like the rumble of a distant earthquake or a whale call are able to travel across massive distances through the water. Because of this physical reality, the exact location of a sound source becomes incredibly unclear to the human ear.
You can't tell where it's coming from.
Right. You don't perceive sound as coming from a specific point in space. You perceive it as a broad, enveloping layer coming from everywhere at once. Deep ambient music takes those exact physical conditions and deliberately turns them into a blueprint for sonic architecture.
I was absolutely blown away by the technical engineering section of the MMR column, breaking down how they actually build that underwater architecture. It specifically highlights the sub-bass range, focusing on frequencies between 20 Hz and 80 Hz.
The extreme low end.
Yeah, and I always assumed sub-bass was just that annoying rumble you hear when a car with massive speakers drives past your house, meant to rattle the windows. But in this style of music, those frequencies aren't there to provide a catchy bass line or to make the track hit harder.
Not at all. That 20 Hz to 80 Hz band is deployed purely to create a physical sensation of pressure and mass. These sub-bass frequencies are usually designed without a sharp or clear attack.
I always hear audio engineers throw terms like that around. For you listening right now, when we say attack, we are talking about how fast a sound reaches its peak volume. If you slam your hand on a piano key, the attack is instant and sharp.
Yes, very sudden.
But if you slowly roll up the volume knob on your stereo over the course of 10 seconds, that is a very slow attack.
And that slow roll-up is exactly what is happening here. The sub-bass fades in incredibly slowly, and it fades out just as slowly.
Sneaking up on you.
Because of that gradual, almost imperceptible shift in volume, the listener is placed in a state where they aren't merely hearing the low end with their eardrums. They are quite literally feeling it as atmospheric pressure against their body.
Wow.
And to maintain that illusion of being underwater, the producers also flatten out the mid-low to mid-frequencies. They strip back the complex overtones to keep the density of the sound completely uniform across the spectrum.
It totally makes sense when you phrase it like that. It is like standing near the massive engine room on a ferry. You aren't tapping your foot to a melody coming from the engines. You just feel this continuous, heavy hum in your ribs.
That's a perfect analogy.
So if they are using the low end to create the feeling of the water around you, how are they creating the sheer size of the ocean? That brings us to how they completely abuse reverb.
Oh yeah, the reverb is everything.
In so much of the pop music we listen to, reverb is just a decoration. It is a little echo you slap on a vocal to make the singer sound like they're in a nice concert hall.
Yeah.
But here, the reverb isn't the paint on the walls, it is the actual structural foundation of the building.
What's fascinating here is how they manipulate the early reflections and the transients of the sound.
Break that down for us.
Think of a transient as the initial smack of a noise. If you hit a snare drum, that sharp, instantaneous crack right at the millisecond of impact, that is the starting transient. It tells your brain exactly where the sound came from and exactly when it started.
It locates the sound.
Right. By scrubbing that sharp transient away and choosing incredibly long reverbs, where the initial bounce of the sound is completely ambiguous, the producer hides the origin of the noise. And because that reverberated sound never fully decays or fades away before the next one begins, it creates a continuous, unbroken state of existence.
Which plays a massive trick on human perception, right? It completely stretches your internal clock.
It does.
When the sound you are listening to is just a constant shifting layer of echo with no clear starting transient, the actual beginning and end of the track lose all of their meaning. You're just suspended in the middle of it.
Time just stops.
You could be listening for 3 minutes or 3 hours and your brain kind of loses track of the difference.
And this completely redefines how rhythm functions. In standard ambient techno, there is often a pulse. But as the research makes clear, this pulse is not in order to dance. It is comparable to a depth gaze.
Like a sonar.
Imagine a sonar ping on a submarine appearing at regular intervals purely to give you a measurement of time passing in the dark. It gives you a sense of scale. But in deep ambient, even that sonar ping is often removed completely.
Leaving you in this seemingly timeless void. But the sources note it isn't completely static, which is why it doesn't just sound like dead air.
Right. There has to be some movement.
There are these tiny micro fluctuations in the sound, a slight shift in the texture of the hum, or a faint echo moving from your left ear to your right ear that keep just enough of a sense of internal time alive so your brain doesn't completely tune it out.
And the psychological impact of all this engineering is profound. By utilizing those sustained low frequencies, the incredibly slow rates of change, and those massive, endless reverbs, this music actively works to physiologically lower the listener's arousal levels.
So unlike putting on an upbeat pop song to get hyped for a workout or a somber acoustic ballad when you're feeling sad, this music isn't trying to evoke a traditional emotional response at all.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, this music functions as a physiological tool. It bypasses the traditional emotional evocation of music and directly targets your state of consciousness.
It's adjusting your awareness.
Yes, deep ambient has such a high affinity with states of deep concentration, introspection, and even half-awake, semi-conscious states.
Which explains the focus playlists.
Exactly. It is perfectly designed to be working background music or an aid for meditation because the design philosophy stabilizes your attention without ever demanding it. It occupies just enough of your brain's processing power to block out distracting background noise, but it keeps your cognitive load entirely constant so you can focus on the task in front of you.
But if they are stripping away the main beat and blurring all the edges, how do these subgenres not just all blur together into one giant puddle of sound? I want to make sure we can clearly separate these styles for you, the listener.
It can definitely get confusing.
Because the research provides a fantastic breakdown of how deep ambient compares to its close cousins, dub techno and deep techno. If you glance at a playlist, they all seem to share that same watery, echoing sonic palette. But the intention and the mechanics behind them are fundamentally different.
It all comes down to hierarchy. The author of the MMR column provides a really brilliant rule of thumb regarding the master and servant dynamic of rhythm to help distinguish them.
The master and servant dynamic.
Let's look at dub techno first.
Yeah.
Imagine you're listening to a dub techno track. You're going to hear rhythmic delays and echoes bouncing to the exact beat of a kick drum. The structure of techno is injected with dub music's spatial processing, highlighting the back and forth swing between the rhythm and the reverb.
So the rhythm is in charge.
In dub techno, the rhythm is the master. The drum is the boss, and the rhythm drives and dictates how the space behaves.
But in deep ambient, that relationship is totally inverted.
Completely inverted. In deep ambient, the space itself is the master. The vast deep sea space completely envelops whatever subtle rhythm might be present. The space dictates the rules, and the rhythm is just a guest floating inside of it.
And what about deep techno then?
Deep techno sits in its own unique lane. Deep techno features minimal structures, slower tempos, and very restrained development, but it fundamentally remains club music.
So people still dance to it.
Right. It borrows the deep sea acoustics and the heavy atmospheric pressure, but it holds onto its dance floor function. You can still play it in a club for people to sway to. Ambient techno and deep ambient intentionally step away from that club context entirely.
And stepping away from the club context hasn't diminished its impact or its reach at all. In fact, it's quite the opposite. This low-stimulation deep-sea sound isn't a symptom of techno dying out or fading away into obscurity. It represents a massive expansion of the genre's utility.
It really is everywhere now.
Today, this sound has become a universal language. You hear these deep, slow, low-arousal soundscapes connecting across modern art galleries, playing softly in sleek, personal workspaces, and dominating our modern everyday streaming culture.
It has transitioned from a highly specialized sound meant solely for the chill-out room at a 1990s rave to becoming a fundamental baseline for how we manage our own focus and mental space in the modern world. People are using it as an acoustic shield against distraction.
So what does this all mean? When we look back at the entire journey outlined in our sources today, from the ambient furniture music experiments of the 1970s and the sweat-drenched mechanical techno rhythms of the 1980s to the pioneering rule-breaking synthesis of the orb, and finally down into the extreme beatless depths of modern deep ambient, it represents a total success in redefining what music can be.
It really does.
It proves that music doesn't have to be an isolated event that you sit and consume from start to finish. It can be a continuous, livable environment. It is a stunning piece of sonic architecture built out of sub-bass pressure and infinite reverb, mimicking the actual physical laws of the deep ocean to give your brain a quiet space to simply exist and focus.
Which brings up something really interesting. This raises an important question. As we move toward a future dominated by spatial computing and augmented reality, where we are literally wearing computers on our faces to blend the digital and physical worlds, will this deep-sea architectural approach to sound become the default way we design the audio for our virtual living spaces?
Oh, wow.
Instead of just putting on headphones to listen to a playlist, will we end up wearing headsets just to constantly live inside these engineered acoustic oceans to protect our attention from the chaos of the outside world?
That is a fascinating thought to leave on and a wild image to picture. Millions of us just walking around inside our own private digital submarines. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the underwater architecture of deep ambient. We hope you enjoyed exploring the physics and the psychology behind these incredible sounds, and that it changes the way you look at your own focus playlists. As you go about the rest of your day, take a moment to really listen to the space around you. Notice the hums, the pressure, the invisible environment you are walking through. Until next time, keep exploring.